Mr. Ciaran Martin is going to be our keynote. He has been the CEO of the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Centre since March of 2016. The new public-facing London Centre brings together the UK's cyber expertise to make the UK the safest place to live and to do business online. That's a good motto. Previously, he was the Director General for Cybersecurity at the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. He has also served in the Cabinet Office as the Constitution Director, Director of Security and Intelligence, and Principal Private Secretary to the Cabinet Secretary. Mr. Martin has held a variety of policy positions and roles at the Treasury and spent 3 years in the National Audit Office. Mr. Martin, I'd like to welcome you to the stage, and if everyone can give a warm hand of welcome to Mr. Martin, I'd like to thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction and for the honor of this invitation. It's a real honor to be back in the US. It's a real honor to be back at this conference, and I hope I'm not being too presumptuous in saying I feel amongst friends. I have the privilege of being the first head of the United Kingdom's new National Cyber Security Centre. We were formally opened by Her Majesty the Queen in February this year, and we aim to bring together in a single place the UK's operational cybersecurity work. It's part of GCHQ, our signals intelligence agency, and a major part of the attraction of having the NCSC within GCHQ was the opportunity to develop even further the 7 decades long and counting US-UK security partnership in signals intelligence into the new field of cybersecurity. So let me begin by paying tribute to all our friends and colleagues in the United States, particularly in the National Security Agency, but also in the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the CIA, the private sector, and elsewhere. Everything we do in the UK is enabled by you, and we are grateful every day for it. If you don't mind, I'm going to begin with 2 stories. One, an apology in advance for what I'm about to say, and the other, a bit of context. So I hope you don't mind if I explain that. First, the apology. When Dr. Lontrionte kindly invited me to do a keynote at this prestigious event, and it was an invitation I was only too delighted to accept, it was before either of us knew that the British Parliament would vote, as it did last week, for a general election 2 weeks into its 5-year term. Now, whatever the outcome of that election will mean for the country, as far as the next 20 minutes or so are concerned, it means that I, like all other public servants in the UK, am under a constitutional duty to be even more politically impartial than usual. We've got a part of our system called the Propriety and Ethics Unit, which polices all this, and as it happens, I know the head of that unit very well. So I called her up last week after the news of the election broke, just to check that going ahead with this event was okay. I explained it was an expert event on a subject that, although of first-order national importance, is not a subject of first-order political controversy. "Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine," she replied with her characteristic directness. She then paused. "I mean, so long as you don't say anything interesting." So my apologies in that I'm required by law to be dull this afternoon. Please don't clap, they may think I'm being interesting. Now, some further context. I thought of the election and how I might approach this talk given those circumstances when I saw media coverage of the Global March for Science at the weekend. I don't know what it was like in the States, but in London we had the sight of thousands of tenured academics taking to the street, and I was struck by one superb chant which went as follows: "What do we want? Evidence-based policy decisions. When do we want it? After full peer review." So I thought I'd bring these 2 themes together, and I'd imagine a hypothetical situation where on the 9th of June, whatever the outcome, somebody is asking me about what we should do in the next 5-year Parliament on cybersecurity and asking what the evidence suggests we should do. How do we as a nation fight back against this problem? So to do that, I'm going to try to address 4 fundamental questions. First, why should Western governments even care about cybersecurity? Second, what has and hasn't worked so far? Third, what can government do, if anything? And finally, what are the early lessons from the UK's new approach? So to the first question, why should governments even care? Well, let me talk through 4 cyber attacks to explain the 2 reasons governments should care. The first example is French. As you will know, in April 2015, TV5 Monde, a sort of French-language version of BBC World, was taken off air for 11 hours in one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks ever seen. The second example is from here in DC. The theft, which the then Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, attributed to China, of the personal details of more than 20 million past, present, and prospective US federal government employees. The third and fourth examples are British. One is a company called TalkTalk, one of our largest telcos. It got done by a basic SQL injection, a technique dating from the last century, perpetrated allegedly by someone born in this century. It remains for now the only UK cyber attack ever to have led the national news. And the fourth example is an attack on a small hairdressing salon in GCHQ's hometown of Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. This was a small-scale criminal ransomware attack. It led to the salon shutting down for 4 days, having to notify all of its customers under law that their personal data had been compromised. They lost all their appointments, and they had to pay around $2,000, which is a lot for a business of that size, in ransom. Now, these 4 attacks give us 2 separate reasons to care. One is obvious. The first 2 attacks are about national security. No democracy can stand for having its public broadcaster taken offline by another state or having its civil service personnel database stolen. These are strategic national security threats that governments have to counter. But the other reason is arguably less obvious. The TalkTalk attack, however high profile, was not a national security event. And clearly the same is true of the attack on the hair salon, however traumatic it was for its owners. But there is a risk here that governments have to manage, and it's about public confidence in the digital economy. The UK is, on all relevant measures, one of the most digitally advanced and digitally dependent economies in the world. It's the most advanced on some indicators. So if you have large-scale public panic, as we did over TalkTalk, where for one weekend the British media were running a story that turned out not to be true, that 4 million people in a country of 64 million were at risk of having their bank accounts emptied, then there is a real strategic risk that people start to lose trust in online services. Similarly, one isolated attack on one small business does not matter nationally. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those attacks do matter if notifications of data breaches become a part of people's everyday experience of the internet. So our contention in the UK is, as well as caring about cybersecurity for national security reasons, governments should care about it because confidence in the economy depends on it. So if those are the 2 reasons why we should care, how have we been doing in the UK? Well, until 2015, our approach was broadly activist in terms of national security and passive in terms of the economic agenda. Let me unpack that a little. In support of our national security objectives, we invested heavily in secret intelligence capabilities, in data acquisition, analysis, and other tools. With the support of partner agencies, particularly, as I've said, the NSA here in the US, this approach made us better at understanding, detecting, and combating the biggest and best threats. The threats from hostile states, serious organized transnational crime, and others are real, and they are doing damage to us and to our allies. But we can be reasonably pleased with our record on cyber-related national security to date. But the second approach was to encourage, from 30,000 feet, the private sector to grip the wider economic problem. So we set up government and industry forums. We issued guidance. We talked a lot about partnership, and we encouraged sectoral information sharing partnerships. We went to an awful lot of corporate dinners, mostly scaring people about the threat before tucking into dessert. And how did this work out? Well, the record here is more mixed. There are some brilliant successes. We've established groundbreaking partnerships with some of our main communication service providers to share declassified threat data so they can block attacks at scale, stopping hundreds of thousands of attacks per week. Separately, our finance sector, which is something of huge strategic importance to the United Kingdom, has established a very useful information sharing capability and sector-wide mechanisms for pen testing and emergency response. But no one is arguing that we're where we need to be across the economy and wider society as a whole. And as I've said before, too many attacks are getting through. Worse, far too many basic attacks are getting through. The statistics are there to prove it. Nearly half of recorded crime in the UK is now cyber-related. Nearly half of UK companies identified at least one cybersecurity breach or attack in the past year, and when it comes to large companies, it's more like 2 in 3. These aren't high-grade attacks. Most cyber attacks, including the 2 UK examples I mentioned earlier, are preventable and can be defended against. The term APT, Advanced Persistent Threats, so beloved of the Commentariat, is actually deeply unhelpful because the techniques employed by most attackers, whilst persistent and threatening, are by no means advanced. And why does this matter? Well, again, it matters because of the strategic risk to confidence in the digital economy. But it also matters because of the diversions of resources. I have the privilege of employing some of the best people in the world in cybersecurity. We need them focused on the very best adversaries, not the everyday preventable attacks. So what is the government's role in tackling all this? As government, we should not do just anything the private sector can do for itself, but government can and should look at what is and isn't working. And here are 5 public policy lessons we draw from the evidence of our experience so far as to why we're not yet where we need to be. One is properly understanding how the cyber attack ecosystem works. And as the National Cybersecurity Centre, we've just published a report on this. Fundamentally, cyber attacks are about return on investment. If it's easy and profitable to attack something, attacks will happen. It follows that if defences are raised even a little, the marginal return on that investment falls, attackers go away, or attackers visit less often. We see this from intelligence, we see it from open source research. Making attackers work harder works. A second lesson is that there are some difficulties in the way the market is operating at the moment. An obvious illustration is the problem of large-scale DDoS attacks. Take the example of the attack on the major DNS provider here in the Eastern Seaboard, when hundreds of thousands of internet-connected closed-circuit television cameras were diverted to become weapons against the provider company. The problem in terms of economic theory here was throughout the attack, the CCTV cameras worked. So from the perspective of the manufacturer, owner, or customer of these cameras, there is no commercial incentive to fix that problem. There is a wider third problem of incentives. In public debate, we've too often allowed cybersecurity in the commercial world to become badged as an intractable and unmanageable technical problem of such sophistication that mere mortals cannot understand it. So the incentive for providers of services is to emphasize the threat and then sometimes sell solutions on the basis that the customer doesn't really need to understand what they're buying, but the problem is taken care of. I don't think that's helpful. Indeed, it can be damaging. Cybersecurity is about risk management, nothing more, nothing less. A corporate board would not hire a legal firm to manage its legal risks without properly understanding what the advisors were saying and doing. The same needs to be true of cybersecurity. Hiring external experts, however good, is no use unless the customer understands what problems they're trying to solve and what assets they're trying to protect and what the supplier is doing. Now, in the UK, fewer than 1 in 3 boards has, according to one survey, an individual board member responsible for cybersecurity. That's the sort of issue we'll need to fix. A fourth lesson linked to this is about people. There's much talk about people being the weakest link in cybersecurity. That makes as much sense as saying players are the weakest link in a sports team. The internet is a human creation for use by humans. We have to construct solutions that people who are not expert in cybersecurity can use and follow easily and cost-effectively in the environment they live and work in. If we allow the subject to be shrouded in mystique, in fear and panic, then we won't fix the problems we need to. And a fifth and final lesson is about what works. To date, governments have been betting heavily on voluntary information sharing initiatives within sectors as the best strategic solution to the problem. This has been orthodoxy across the West for about a decade, and there have been some big successes, as I've said, in finance. But after a decade, I think the evidence shows that more weight has been put on these initiatives than they can bear. They're a very useful part of a strategic approach to the problem, but no more than a part. So that's one example of looking at the evidence. So finally, what have these insights meant for the UK's approach? Well, since 2015, they've pushed us towards a different operational strategy. We've moved from a passive approach to a more interventionist one. We are fighting back at national level. And the aim, bluntly, is to make the United Kingdom a harder target so that attackers will have to work harder to get the effect they want, so that more attackers will fail and fewer attackers will try. We believe that this will benefit not just our economy, but our national security as well, because plenty of attacks that threaten national security involve basic breaches of defences that shouldn't happen. So our strategy is about making it easier to raise basic defences across the board. We're trying to do this by, first, finding gaps in what is happening in the private sector and moving directly to fix them, by applying them to ourselves in government, and then second, publishing evidence of what is and isn't working to try to encourage wider adoption of best practice, and third, explaining clearly to people in plain English what they can do to protect themselves. This is mostly basic, uncomplicated stuff that isn't being done properly yet. Now, if you're not bored yet, let me give the obligatory volley of statistics to make sure we get there. So we're tackling phishing. We've got this brilliant small private sector partner. They automate requests for takedowns of any phishing site hosted in the UK, web inject malware hosted in the UK, and UK government-branded phishing sites hosted anywhere in the world. Before we started, the median uptime for a UK-hosted phishing site was 27 hours, and only 47% were down within 24 hours. Now the median uptime for a site is just 1 hour, and 4 and 5 are down within 24 hours. UK-hosted web injects are down from 525 hours to 43 hours. Government-branded phishing site uptimes are down from 45 hours to 6 hours. We're tackling spoofing. We've used the DMARC protocol with our tax authority as proof of concept. Last year, they blocked 300 million spoof emails purporting to be from them. Now we're rolling that out across the whole of government. We're blocking at scale. This month we're starting for our own government a service which means users will not be directed to known bad sites. We aim to have 1 million public service users by the end of this calendar year. We're making it easier for smaller public authorities who might not be able to afford the big commercial services to defend themselves. We've built a service called WebCheck. It scans for vulnerabilities and out-of-date certificates on the websites of those authorities for free and tells them how to fix any problems. We've now got around 100 public authorities signed up. And we're making it easier for everyday citizens to defend themselves. We took a big risk by going public against conventional wisdom on passwords. Some groundbreaking behavioural science research by University College London showed us that if the average citizen followed government password guidance in their daily, personal and professional life, it was the equivalent of asking them to memorise a new 600-digit number every month. That is quite clearly mad. So we changed the guidance. We now say use password managers, apply special protection only to the things you most care about, and don't change your password unless you've reason to believe it's been compromised. The reaction's been really positive. So these are encouraging early signs. They are no more than that. We do not claim to have found all the answers. And we need more data and more metrics. It's all very well dramatically lowering the median time for bad sites to be up in the UK, but if most of the damage is done in the early minutes of a bad site's existence, then that's of little use. And we don't know yet whether that's true. What it does show, however, is that government action can have an impact in both incentivising the right behaviour and fixing the underlying technical infrastructure to make it safer in a way users don't even notice. The beauty of the 300 million spoof emails blocked by the tax authority is they were never delivered to anyone's inbox, so no one had to worry about whether or not they were clicking on a dodgy link or opening a bad email. And what does all this do? Well, it allows expert resources to focus on the things that only the government can worry about. So at the National Cybersecurity Centre, that allows our best people to focus on detection and analysis of the biggest strategic threats and the response to it, lasting, enduring cybersecurity in our critical national infrastructure by building in protections as new systems come on stream, protections that will last for decades to come, and focusing on our incident response capability for the most serious attacks, including the public-facing response, because it's our job to give people authoritative, objective assessments and advice when attacks happen, as they will do. So let me leave you with 3 final lessons from our experience. The first is about the relationship between the threat and how you defend against it. Of course, it's exciting to talk about the threat from the most capable states, and of course that threat needs to be tackled, and it's hard to do that. And on both sides of the Atlantic, we have our best people on it. But the everyday stuff, the commodity crime, really, really matters too. And the second is about the link between strategy and organizational structures. Don't get me wrong, it's great having a single national center for cybersecurity and having all this led out of a single organization with access to the best intelligence, data, the best capabilities, and the best partners is a huge help. But you'll have noticed I've barely mentioned organizational structures today. That's because we think they need to be thought about in tandem with strategy. There'd be much less point in having a national cybersecurity centre if it wasn't accompanied by this ambitious new remit to be much more active in pursuit of our national cybersecurity goals than we've previously been. And the final lesson, cybersecurity is a manageable problem. Let's not overhype it. Let's understand it. Let's help people to manage risks normally like they do elsewhere in life. You may have seen the cover of The Economist, one of the Bibles of UK public policy, the other week saying, "Why computers will never be safe." Is that right? Perhaps. But safer? Undoubtedly. We can do this. We just need to be honest about what's working and what isn't, and to be bold. Thank you.
Wonderful speech, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. The UK actually instituted a program by which commercial companies could, I don't remember the name of it, could evaluate themselves with regard to privacy and controls.
Oh, yes.
And so I always wanted to know, was there ever a study done to show if there was a dramatic effect with regard to fewer breaches or something a little bit more empirical? Or another question would be is how is that working?
So the scheme's called Cyber Essentials. It's the basics that we would expect everyone to do. In terms of public policy, we've mandated that any government procurement over a certain small threshold has to be given to a company with that accreditation. We haven't done the evaluation that you've spoken about, largely on the grounds that it's a little early to do that. What I think we will be doing in the future is publishing basically evaluations of pretty much everything we do. So the sort of statistics I talked about in my remarks, those will all be publicly available. Analysis of most of the efforts that we make will be available. It's just not there yet. But we expect to be held accountable for what we do.
Of commercial companies are employing that?
I think it's in the tens of thousands, but it's not yet where we'd want it to be. I don't have a percentage term, but I can certainly try to get that information and make it available. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marietje Schaken. Thank you for your remarks. I'm a member of the European Parliament, so here it comes. What do you think Brexit is going to mean for intelligence sharing internationally, British leadership when it comes to state norms, anything that you talked about, let's say 5 years from now? What are you anticipating, or what should we expect?
Thanks for that. Were you here for the bit where I said I had to be boring? I mean, I think the Prime Minister and senior government leaders have set out the position very clearly. We want, post-Brexit, to have very close security partnerships. We already have lots of deep and enduring bilateral security partnerships, both in cybersecurity and elsewhere. And we'll do our bit to keep the continent and ourselves and the whole world as safe as we can. I think we've one more.
One more, and it's quick. So what you've done is sort of a departure. You could even use the word innovation, although I hate it. What led you to set up this center? What led you to centralize everything?
So I think a number of things. As I said, it was in tandem with a strategic rethink. And in fact, this conference 2 years ago was quite influential in that. There was a very good talk at the speakers' dinner, I recall, by Art Serafo, going through the history of US public policy in this space. And essentially, about perhaps the limitations in terms of where we'd got to in public-private partnerships and information sharing and the need to try something else. So there was that element of the strategic rethink. There were then, I think, there was concern within the senior levels of government that our response to incidents was too clunky across too many different agencies. Not just the response to incidents, but indeed our ability to work with key industries to protect them. So when the banking sector came to talk to government about what they might do, they had to talk to too many people. So we needed to rationalize all of that. So I think it was a combination of strategy, the need to rationalize the number of organizations, but then it was, should it be within the sort of security community or outside it? It needed to be within the security community in order to make sure it had the data and capabilities and skilled people, but we had to change because we had to be a lot more public. We had to talk about it. We had to indeed get new premises so that we could get people in more easily to talk to them. We publish far more data and guidance than we've ever done because we can't just we had to adapt. We have to make use of the classified information in ways that lead to actionable and useful material for other people. So it was those three things, really. Well, thank you very much again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.